So a very good example is the haunted mansion in the Disney parks. Here in the US, because level design needs to be logic, and they need to be logic for somebody that is not creating the game.
And I'm terrified of that because I can imagine the nuances of humor, the authenticity you just spoke about, going just completely awry with the cultural context and creating a situation where people might be so offended that they don't want to come back to that kind of game.
Yeah, no, and that actually happens a lot. So yeah, that's a huge haha for them because it's very rare for like a person to sit down and play a game in a language that they're not familiar with.
Today, we're welcoming to the show Dr. Marina Fontolan. Dr. Marina Fontolan, please tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Hello, Ryan. Hello, everybody. As Ryan said, my name is Marina Fontolan. I am an associate professor of instruction at the Department of Communication from the University of Texas at San Antonio. So I am the one now basically teaching everything about video games and game studies and also intercultural communication.
Video games and game studies. And you said is there an intersection there between what you're teaching in intercultural communication and what you teach in game studies?
Sure. Of course, because my research is actually about video game localization. So it's basically a process that adapts and translates video games and actually any other products that are sold worldwide from one culture to another. So intercultural communications actually has a lot to do with localization. So yes, there is a lot of intersections over there.
What are the most fun things that you're looking at right now?
Well, when it comes to localization, there is a lot of like adaptations that people are doing for different theme park rides. So a very good example is the haunted mansion in the Disney park. So here in the US, we have the haunted mansion that you basically go on a ride in this like haunted place that has 999 foolish ghosts over there. And they, of course, have space for one more, which can be, of course, you as the rider, which is very fun. But when it gets, for example, to Disneyland in France, they changed that a little bit because they wanted to attract more adults to the park. So they brought in more references to horror and Western American movies to that ride. So, and that's called Phantom Manor. So it changes the ride a little bit. And then when you go to the Asian theme parks, specifically, for example, Hong Kong and Shanghai Disneyland, because of how Chinese culture understands the death, for them is quite problematic to have like a ghost attraction. They find that to be very untasteful, let's say. So they changed everything for Mystic Manor, in which you follow a very small monkey that open a Pandora box kind of MacGuffin, and everything kind of goes crazy on the ride. So they really change everything to adapt to that culture. But the gist of the ride's kind of it's kind of like the same. It is a very fun thing to look that it goes beyond the video games themselves.
That's so fun. I'm a huge fan of the parks and experiential rides. I have, I think, Jack Skellington there. They have the Jack Skellington rebrand every Halloween where I'm sure they put in Jack Skellington into the Haunted Mansion.
On the original Disneyland, yeah, I saw that was 2013. It's just my favorite. I love it.
Awesome. I love it too. It sounds like that you're doing more than just classic video games then. You're also looking at immersive experiences. What other kind of immersive experiences are you looking at?
Yeah, for my other course, for one of my courses that I'm looking more into gamification, I'm also taking a better look at Universal Studios Nintendo World theming. So how they're basically like gamifying the park, the like amusement park experience. So how they basically translated video games into the real world. So it's been basically like a passion project of mine. I don't know if that's going to become a full-blown research down the road, but it's just some like of my side interest.
I haven't been to Nintendo World yet. I'd love to go and experience that. I know that it's had a lot of commercial success. And in your research, have you had findings about how intercultural communication factors into these kinds of immersive experiences like Super Nintendo World?
Yes, I mean to certain extent, like intercultural communication comes in this idea of like how are you going to translate this experience, not just from like translating from different media, so like from the media of the video games to a theme park that is like a completely different media, but also how you're going to like translate that into basically different audiences. Because of course, like the audiences that go to an amusement park in Japan is different than here in the US. So how you basically go from one to another. So for example, in Japan, they have both the Mario Kart experience and the Yoshi ride. And here in the US, at least until this year that Epic Universe opened, they just had the Mario Kart experience and they decided to bring that up because Mario Kart is of course more known worldwide than Yoshi and Yoshi Island as a video game. So even though we now have here in the US the Yoshi experience, they when they were like adapting to the American parks, they decided to bring in the Mario Kart experience. And like the rides are the same as much as I can tell. I also have to like look on how they like explain how the ride works to have like a better grasp on how they actually manage to translate from like the Japanese audience to the American.
So much of what we do is centered around audience. What have you found in your research into audiences for these theme park experiences?
The for what I could find, I know that the like Japanese audience are much more focused on very specific franchises and they love that and they're willing to wait like hours and hours on end to be able to see a parade or to go to a certain attraction. And that's not an issue, it seems, for them. But when it comes here to like the West, there is much more of this idea of like basically like developing like a Fordism for entertainment. You go to ride one, you have like, I don't know, 20 minutes of wait is your max wait time. And then you go to the other ride that is like 10 minutes. So like it's basically like you try to get the most out of it in a way of like, I'm doing the most things rather than Japan is more about like, I really like this franchise. So I am going to spend like a lot more time on that place so I can gather all the experiences it has to offer. So it has a very different take basically on how they perceive those experiences.
That's such a different mentality for approaching something as expensive as a theme park, because they're not cheap. Those are some expensive experiences. And I assume they're expensive in other countries too?
Yeah, I mean, I know that Japan they're cheaper and also yeah, and also in Europe, not just like for like Disney or Universal parks, but also like their local parks are also much cheaper than here. So here is basically became like this premium experience, which for what I can tell, it wasn't the original intent to begin with. It should be like something more affordable and affordable for everybody. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, for sure. I've seen these videos about these original old European theme parks. How do they differ from the Disney experience we're used to in the United States?
They are usually some of them are actually built in like historical parks. So you have like for example a real castle that was built I don't know in the 14th century or something like that, and the theming of the entire amusement park is actually related to that castle to begin with, to that like historical side. So it has like a different, I would say, for the very little know about the subject, is that like they tend to focus more on these like history and entertainment, how to basically put history and entertainment together in a way that it's fun to learn. That's something that is not, I mean, regard not counting, for example, Animal Kingdom or at Pet Center that have like this more of edutainment aspects for themselves. It is not the focus of like the American theme parks in general. It's basically like go there and
These immersive experiences that you're speaking about with these theme parks, does that also relate to your virtual reality game experience and research?
yeah, I haven't been looking too much into the VR experiences because I have to say, like, I've been a computer gamer for all my life. So I basically focus on like this more traditional computer gaming. So basically games that needs a mouse and a keyboard for you to
Tell us about that research. What does your research into computer gaming reveal?
yeah. So When it comes to localization, I was more focused into the role of localization in the video game industry up until basically recently. And I found out that because of the internet, localization was something that actually exploded because, of course, like the video game industry knew that there was an audience for those games out there, but they couldn't actually have a grasp of what that audience was would actually look like. So in the very beginning, it was pretty much common to have games that were localized into very specific languages because those publishers had like offices in Europe, for example, or like someplace in Asia, but they were very much like far in between. And that's when we get the acronym EFIGS: English, French, Italian, German, and Spanish as like the basic languages for you to have on your game. But because of the internet, they realized how, for example, the global south is actually a huge market for video games. And now we have things like such as Russia, simplified Chinese, Brazilian Portuguese, Korean, Latin American Spanish. So in the end of the day, like the role of localization actually grew in the industry, and nowadays is quite like an important asset for you to have on your game. Something that is, I would say, it's changing a little bit because of the use of AI tools. Because, of course, I mean, localization can be a very expensive process within the industry because they usually charge by the word. So think about games that you take like 250 hours to complete, such as Zelda Breath of the Wild, GTA, Red Dead Redemption, and all those like super big games. They have tons and tons of lines of text to translate, and then it's not just translating the text. Sometimes you need to pay voice actors to also have the voices in different languages. So it is a very expensive process. And nowadays, because of generative AI tools, a lot of the localization people are actually losing their jobs and their roles because they are just like automating everything, which is actually a shame because localization do require a lot of creativity because when you are translating, you you can't just, for example, translate a pun from one language to another word by word. Is not going to make sense for the player on the other hand. And like these AI tools, of course, they can like help and facilitate the translation process, but you do need a human being to work on this creative side. That is something that a machine cannot do at all. So yeah, it's been what they are facing.
And for our audience, can you define localization? My understanding is that we're talking about how translators who work locally in a market can translate a game to be more palatable for that market in their own specific language. What is localization?
Yeah, localization is basically the process that translates and adapts to games from culture A to culture B. And translating here, it's not just about the word to word translation, so saying the same thing in a different language. It also means translating meaning and like changing. You need to change the meaning because the way that the original culture understands certain situations is not going to be the same as the culture that is receiving the game. And there is also like issues such as regulations and laws that you need to be aware of. So always a good example is actually Nintendo in the 90s here in America. The Nintendo America here has had their own regulations, and they didn't allow for any references to drugs on their video games. So if there were any references of like drugs or drug use in video games outside, this game would have to be changed, even sometimes in their story and graphics and all that, to accommodate to this policy that they had. And that's the reason why if you go to an arcade and you have like a 99 late 90s or 1990s game, you're going to see messages such as like heroes don't use drugs or something like that. So you're going to see a lot of that from Nintendo.
I love that. I mean, I grew up playing some of these kinds of games in the arcade. I remember those kinds of messages exactly the way you just described them, which is really fun to go back to those memories. What are some of the other kinds of challenges in localization that you've seen in your work?
Yeah, I mean, one of the major challenges is that localizers are usually localizing the game as the game is being made. So they don't have like full access to the context in which things are going on. Sometimes they will understand something on a very different context than is actually happening in the game. So when the localization comes out, it would just not make sense on that version. So for them, it's quite difficult. So for them, they have like this now big challenge of like basically translate an entire game that is not finished yet. So sometimes not even like the developers themselves, like the creators of the game know how that thing is going to end. So for them for them it's quite challenging. That is quite challenging. Besides, of course, the AI tools that I mentioned a little.
Tell me more about how those AI tools have impacted work in the gaming industry.
In general, there were some cuts in jobs, especially when it comes to these more technical jobs. So like programming, for example, there were some jobs that were cut. Not so much on the art department because it's still like video, especially on these big commercial video games that we have nowadays, they have a very specific art style that needs to continue because of the franchises. So at least for the time being, these jobs are kind of holding there. But as we get new franchises and new games, this is probably going to change. So we're going to see more and more of like generative AI being used on games. And also localization because of this, like of how easy things can be translated. That is a little bit, I would say it's a little bit better than Google Translate, which is also another type. It is an artificial intelligence, it's just another type of artificial intelligence. I think I would say that like localization was probably one of the biggest hits when it comes to job cuts in the video game industry because of the AI.
Which AI is best for this kind of work? Because I know we have famous examples of somebody trying to craft a message for a market that is not their own and failing miserably because they didn't understand the local perspective.
I would say, no idea which one. I would say the least worst. I don't know. Because these machines cannot understand context at all. And that's something human beings can. So there is this like major, and of course, when it comes to like how capitalism works, of course, they want profit. So if they can cut corners, they will for that. And they won't, and to a certain extent, they won't care too much if the localization doesn't make too much sense because they know that like people will end up buying the game anyways, even though it is not like a good thing. I would say that like on the long term, this might change because of course, if you're getting local like poor quality localizations over and over again, people will just stop buying those games. I think that's what is going to happen because it's kind of like logic when it comes to that. It is a waiting game at this point to see what's going to happen.
So you're at a party and your best friend, your friends, they come to you and they say, tell me about what is most interesting at your workplace right now. What are you researching that is the most interesting thing? Is it the colonization stuff? Is it the video game AI stuff?
I think it would be like let's say my new research topic, which is decolonization in video games. So as a longtime gamer myself, I have played games such as Age of Empires and Sid Meier's Civilization. And don't get me wrong, those games are super fun. I love them. But they do come from a place that like imperialism is a good thing and like erasing cultures is an acceptable practice in human history. And when it comes to adventure games such as Lara Croft's Tomb Raider franchise, which I love to death, what comes into play is how like how they use stereotypes of certain cultures that are of course not the ones that we consider to be super powerful. So like the global north in general. So Europe, here the United States, Canada, and all those. So they tend to be very stereotypical. And for example, the last game for Tomb Raider, which was Shadow of the Tomb Raider, they started in Mexico on the Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. Which is okay. It is a very important holiday for them, but it's not the only one by any means. So why not celebrating? Why not showing, for example, other facets of that culture that is not the Day of the Dead that everybody like knows that exists, you know? So basically my research is trying to think of like how can we make those games more interesting and less stereotypical? Rethinking the idea of like we need to colonize these cultures for them to be understandable and digestible.
You mentioned colonization and this idea of erasure of culture. Can you tell us more about how that works in the context of video games? Because I'm playing a video game, I'm not always thinking about imperialism and how things aren't being shown. I'm just playing the game and I'm in the moment. Can you pull back that curtain for me and show me what I'm missing?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, I started to actually pay attention to that because I am a historian myself. So that's because, I mean, before that, I wasn't actually thinking about it. So, one thing that actually struck a chord of like, I need to sit down and actually study that was the Shadow of Tomb Raider game because it was very, because I mean, the way that they portrayed not just Mexico, but then Peru and all their culture over there was extremely like stereotypical for me. And it bugged me the entire game because it actually broke my immersion of it. And then I started thinking back of like, why wasn't I thinking about those things before? It's because in the end of the day, it struck a chord on me being a Latin American person. I'm originally from Brazil, but like Peru is just like our beloved neighbor. So for me, it was a question of like how my identity ended up being played on that game. That's something that I wasn't happy. So that's where it struck, and it basically pulled the curtain for me.
Can you tell us more about how being from Brazil has impacted your research and let you see things that maybe other people can't see because you have that cultural experience of growing up in Brazil?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think growing up in Brazil allowed me to get to know different cultures from basically another perspective that wasn't the one that Hollywood was selling it. Because of course, I mean, Brazil is a country that is, I would say, is as big as the United States, like the continental United States, not counting, for example, Alaska and Hawaii. So like when it comes to territory, both countries are kind of like the same size. So, like, I could see that in Brazil, we had several different cultures. We have several different cultures going on and coexisting. And also cultures from Brazilian overseas also coexisting there. And that's something that when it comes to like Hollywood and the way that Hollywood built up what America and the United States is, it is a pretty much like a whitewashed, very like middle class understanding of what the US is. So it's always so in the end of the day, like I managed to see that like things are just much more complex that it was being shown to me. So when I came here to the US, for example, I started seeing also like all these different American cultures that we can find. I mean, it's not just what Hollywood says America and the United States are. It is much more than that. So I could start like making more and more connections this way. And because of that, I became more critical also of this media that is being shown to me. And I mean, and again, I do have a lot of fun on those media. It is not like an issue of like, let's throw everything out and start again. It is not that. It is like how we can make this better, how we can make this more.
I want to know what the least problematic games are and what the most problematic games are for this idea of making sure that people feel welcome to play the game.
Well, this is a billion-dollar question. So let's see. I would say like Tomb Raider games, Uncharted. So like these like adventure that has the archaeologist slash adventurer. They're pretty complicated. All of them are. Even though, for example, I did love Uncharted 4 because they basically created a fantasy pirate city. But again, it was an idea of piracy that was built around what Hollywood understands of piracy and not like the actual historical thing that we can see all over the Caribbean. That is very, again, it's very complex. It's very different depending on where you're looking. So these ones are pretty complicated. I do love, but when it comes to good representation, I would say the game called Never Alone. It's a great representation of the Inuit populations in Canada. And it was a game that was actually created by the Inuits themselves that wanted to talk more about their culture and their understanding of the world and how the world works. And that game is just amazing. I would recommend everybody to work that, play that. And then also, I would recommend you to take a look on a game that is about to be. I don't know exactly when it's going to be released, but it's almost there actually, as far as I'm concerned. That is called Bagdex. This is basically a Pokemon game that is based on the Brazilian culture, and the person who is making it, and all the creators are Brazilians. So yeah, Bagdex is going to be like this very interesting game, and it was so successful that even Nintendo actually greenlighted it, and it's coming out for the Nintendo Switch. I know that there is like tons and tons of like Pokemon knockoffs, but that one specifically because of the success it was and how unsuccessful actually was Sword and Shield, because it was Nintendo trying to bring this idea of like what Great Britain is, and it didn't work. The game is quite boring, in my opinion, I have to say. And even in Pokemon, between Pokemon fans, it's not like nobody kind of is not like the best one for anybody, as far as I'm concerned. So they decided to basically greenlight Bagdex as like this Brazilian version of Pokemon. So they're bringing a lot of like the Brazilian fauna, and you're going to be able to explore the different regions of Brazil and like their specific cultures within it, the specific Pokemons or Bagmons, as they're called in the game. So it's going to be a very interesting one. I'm much looking forward to that.
Well, what else are you looking forward to?
If Tomb Raider continues on this like reboot series, which I hope they do, I really want to see how they're going to continue that story, because I know that like Shadow of the Tomb Raider wasn't like the biggest commercial success, so I don't know if they're actually going to continue that one, but I would love to, just to see how they would change things. And then if there is like if I can also recommend, would I would also recommend a game, Assassin's Creed Liberation, which is basically the first Assassin's Creed that you play as a black person, and she is all about freeing the slaves here in the West. And I think it was a very good representation of like trying to rethink colonialism in the game. So yeah. And I still didn't play it, but everybody says that like Freedom Cry, also from Assassin's Creed, is a great game when it comes to like decolonization and rethinking games. So as I said, like there is a space on the commercial games to actually be interesting and be more culturally sensitive to that.
So I hear this argument that if you are culturally sensitive, if you're culturally competent in the way you approach games, you will have more commercial success. Is that true?
It depends on how you do it, because there is also a need for you to translate that on a good way, because I mean you need to translate in a way that people will understand and enjoy that aspect, and this is not like the easiest thing to be done. So that's something that we as like scholars and also game developers need to sit down and figure out how to do it, because the why we know it's important now. Not that how to do it is the whole other behemoth that we need to figure out. That's for sure.
It sounds like a lot of your work deals with ethnocentrism and imperialism and this idea of colonization. How does that work inform how you open up these conversations for students to better understand those kinds of concepts in the context of video games?
One thing that I do a lot with the students is to ask them to play the games that they have played already after they have read some of the facts, watch some of the classes, so they can like basically revisit that game after, of course, having like a lot of fun on it, and like on a way that is not the goal to destroy the fun or just destroy video games for them, but is to make them think of like what were the choices of those game developers, why they chose to do like that, and what can be different. So it is always in a way for them like to go back and start thinking about the structures, the stories, the choices, and all those, and how everything actually came together to make that game, and how that game can be different, can be improved in some extent.
Tell me about how it changes the way they see the stories in the gameplay.
They usually report to me saying, "Hey, I never thought about games on this through these lenses. I'll be paying attention more to other games that I play." So in a way, they basically change the way they read video games. Of course, I mean, not destroying their fun. As I said to them, like video games are fun. They are there to entertain. So be entertained by them. That's not like a sin or anything like that. It's not because they did like something wrong that you need to throw everything away. It's just like be critical on the idea of like what, why were those choices made and how those choices could be different and how that would impact and how more fun or less fun it would be because of that.
I like that. What are some of the other moments that you find students having whenever they're introduced to these concepts that you teach?
Them don't realize how complex it is to make a video game because like as consumers we usually don't think how anything is actually made. So one of the big moments actually comes on week one that I say, hey, this is the video game industry, this is how it works, and like nobody has an idea of like how complex the entire system is, like how many people actually need to be involved in making video games, especially the big what we call triple A commercial ones. So the ones from Ubisoft, EA Games, Rockstar, so like those big publishers that we have around. So they are, and of course, I mean, we have the indie games, which are just as wonderful as the commercial games that are bringing new things to the table. So think about Expedition 33 that came out this year. That is just fantastic. It was created by a team of basically game designers, veterans. A lot of them worked for Ubisoft to begin with, so they knew, so they had a lot of experience in game making, and they created an amazing game, in my opinion. We have Silk Song, which I still need to, and still need to get there. I actually need to play Hollow Knight to begin with, but it's an amazing game. We also had like Undertale, Stardew Valley, Five Nights at Freddy's. I mean, like how successful is Five Nights at Freddy's? And it was a simple game, but make based on GIFs, you know. So like the good thing about the indie industry is that like they show that games can also be simple and tell a great story. And that's where, for example, Never Alone that I was talking before comes in, Bagdex and all those like alternative games that allows us to rethink how games are made and what we can do with them.
That's just in week 1. Take us through the journey of moments now, because if I'm getting into that big in week 1, I can imagine there's a lot of other aha moments to follow.
A lot of them when it comes, for example, to esports that I talk to in some of my classes, they come with this idea that like esports are not sports, that they're something else. But in the end of the day, like they also have the aha moment of like, okay, this seems like much more alike a traditional sports than I was actually thinking in the beginning. So yeah, that's one of the big ahas. And I also when I ask them to play a game that they have never played before on a language they're not familiar with first, and then they replay that same game on a language that they're familiar with. They see like how difficult it is to have a media that was not made for them and they have to interact with that. So yeah, that's a huge haha for them because I mean, it's very rare for like a person to sit down and play a game in a language that they're not familiar with. They're just going to do the familiar thing. And then when they have this experience of like, okay, this is not for me, then they see like how important it is to have games and all media actually that are focused on their that is actually made for them, that is adapted for them to actually enjoy and have a good time on it. So that's why I love to teach.
Those are the moments of realization for your students. What kind of moments of realization have you had in your research? And this doesn't have to necessarily be just recently, but I'm curious, what kind of moments of aha and realization have you had in your discoveries?
I would think that like one of my biggest moments was the first time that I actually presented about video games on a conference because I mean video games is basically a second nature for me. Like I started playing video games like 6 or 7 years old probably. And like for me it was a very easy thing. And then when I started presenting those on conferences, a lot of teachers would approach me because they didn't understand anything about video games. And they were concerned because like their students were playing video games and they didn't know anything about them. So it was a big aha moment for me of like figuring out that video games is still kind of like a niche thing. And that's something that I didn't like before for that because I was like entrenched, immersed on this. So like for me, it was a big moment because I needed to start like to translate better and better, like what are video games and why are they important to people that has no idea what video games are and what we can do with them. And that's something that sometimes I get like students in my classes that are not familiar with video games at all, but like they either had like family members that love them or they just want to know a little more about because they know that because they see these video games everywhere. So like how do I also bridge my courses both for like the hardcore gamer that loves everything about video games and probably knows sometimes depending on, on the topic more than I do about video games, and also to these like to this audience that is just like discovering video games and wants to know more about them. So that's also it was also like a big aha moment for me of like where where do I draw the line and make these things interesting and understandable for everyone.
What questions have you found most interesting in your research?
So the question that I found most interesting in the research was actually about authenticity in games localization. Because when you start reading about video game localization, all scholars are going to say that like localization is important. And one of the challenges the localizers have is to keep the same authentic feel for the game from version A to version B to like whatever other like version C, D, whatever version, how many versions there's going to be. And then when I went to actually interview the game localizers, I asked them this question. So like, how do you deal with the authenticity thing? And none of them, a lot of them didn't understand the question to begin with. And few once they understood, they were like, we never think about it. It's not something that gets to us on the everyday practice. Just we are there to make that game good for everybody. We are not thinking about like authenticity. We try, of course, not to change the game in a way that is going to be a completely different thing from what it was to begin with. It is not something that we think about on our everyday. So it was a huge discovery actually for me. So like the question of authenticity in video games was just like the most interesting one, for sure.
In the dimensions of authenticity, the credibility of the authenticity here, how do you break up that authenticity as a research topic to study? What are those subdomains that you're looking at that make up authenticity?
Yeah. So one of them is basically like author's intent, like what were the intentions for of the game developers, the game creators themselves, how that can be translated from place A to place B. Also, there is a question of tone. So like how you translate the language's tone from one language to another, because that makes a lot of difference. So when we're talking about media, and especially like immersive media as video games are, and then author's intent, question of tone. Yeah, there is like one, oh yeah, the last one, which is basically about puns, jokes, and like how can you translate those in a way that they will still mean the same but in another language. So there is so it's not just a question of like tone of language, so like it is a more formal game or it's a more informal conversation and all that, but also like all these expressions. So are there like expressions that are actually translatable, aren't there? And if they aren't, what should you do about that on your game? So it is a whole, there's like a whole art. That's what I mean. Localization is a very much an artistic endeavor for sure. And that's something that we need to, that we need to sit down and yeah, think more and more about.
Yeah, I see these auto translate buttons and they'll even like sync the lips so that it looks like you're speaking the language. And I know that these gaming companies are seeing this and thinking, oh, we can save money and just auto translate things. And I'm terrified of that because I can imagine the nuances of humor, the authenticity you just spoke about going just completely awry with the cultural context and creating a situation where people might be so offended that they don't want to come back to that kind of game.
Yeah, no, and that actually happens a lot. I mean, there are, and even like if it is a human doing it, sometimes like because of like a context or sometimes like sometimes you didn't find like the right person to do that game specifically, the localization won't just make sense. So Abduction, for example, which is a game from Cyan that came out like a couple of years ago, it's a good example of that. So they had their game, Cyan had their games being localized into Japanese by a company, and they used the same company to localize Abduction. But like the localization of abduction didn't work at all. Everybody hated it. It got to the point that a fan of the game just created their own fan localization package and uploaded on Steam. So like you can now play abduction, for example, in Japanese with a better translation from a fan that is not from a professional localizer. So these things happen actually. It's not.
Uncompensated fan is doing better at translating a game for a local audience. Does that happen a lot?
I wouldn't say it happens a lot. It used to happen much more before, especially because localization wasn't still a big thing, and like the internet was also super limited. But like nowadays, we still have like some fan localization. So for example, Skyrim for Brazilian Portuguese, it is a fan localization and it's not recognized by Bethesda, for example. So it is just like an add-on thing that you can give to your game. So yes, there are still fans doing that, and there are two reasons for doing that. The company decided not to localize the game to that language specifically, which usually like brings up a lot of like identity issues and people pressuring publishers to have that language in their as also a way for like the publisher to recognize that fan base and saying, hey, you are important enough, here's the investment that we have on you. So yeah, there is basically like the fans doing the localization themselves because they are not being recognized by the publishers, and also the case of like localization didn't work. So this is like a better a better version, or what we perceive that is a better version than what was done. So that still happened. It is not as common as it was before, but it is.
I can imagine the tension for indie game developers who want to signal, hey, your culture is important to us, you're important to us. They don't necessarily have the budget to hire people to say, hey, your culture is important to us. So, how do you see these kinds of companies navigating that kind of constraint of cost versus wanting to be welcoming to all gamers?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the indie scene, then like fans usually like step up to the plate a lot more to help the game developers become more successful. And then of course, like they would be able to have localization done professionally after that. But also like what happens a lot in the indie scene, and I talked to like a couple of indie developers already, is that sometimes they have like friends and family that knows other languages and they are the ones making the localization for the game. So I talked to a couple of Brazilian, for example, indie developers, and they told me like one of them knew German, the other one had a like a wife that knew Italian, I think, and they were the ones translating the game into these languages, and it was basically what they could do. And of course, I mean, it is pretty much common for the indie developers to have English as their base language and then their original language as like another choice. So is the Polish game developer, they're going to have Polish and English as their languages. So like that's usually how they go about it. It is very challenging though. But I mean, fans are good in stepping up to the plate for that.
So, for our students who are aspiring to create games, what are the challenges that they need to be aware of, and how can they solve those challenges after they graduate or even in their actual college degree program? Maybe they're making games now, right? In their spare time.
So yeah, making games in general is a group activity. So the first challenge that you need to overcome is to deal with other people. So you need to learn how to work in groups. Sometimes, and I mean, sometimes it's great to work by yourself, but sometimes also like having somebody else saying, "Hey, this is great," or hey, this can be better. It's just like exactly what you need. So don't come off with the idea of like, I'm going to create my own game from scratch. It can be done. It has been done in the past a lot. So like Stardew Valley, Undertales are great. They're great games that are kind of like more recent, but they are examples of one person do it all game. But that's not the reality of the industry. So be prepared to work on teams. And also like get to know the different process within the industry. So if you are working as an artist in a game, know just a little bit of how a game engine works or how to program a game, because that will help you a lot in talking to the programmer of like what's going on and how to actually fix things. So you have like a general knowledge of all the processes. So you will be able to communicate with like these other groups about what's going on and what can be done to be better. So yeah, this is I think these are the biggest challenges.
Do you see it becoming easier with quote unquote vibe coding? And how does vibe coding change the equation here? Because they make it seem like, oh, you can build an app just by speaking it into existence. Oh, you can build a game, or you'll soon be able to build a game with our advancements in AI just by speaking it into existence. You see that changing the way games might be developed in the future?
Yeah, I think they can be changed, but it will depend a lot on how generative AI is going to turn out. If there will be any regulations on that, which should have, not to create like things that will like destroy human beings, jobs, and all that. I think it will basically open another door for people who doesn't know how to code at all to actually create games. There are some game engines that requires you very little knowledge of coding. So like Unity is one of them, Unreal is also like another of them. So you do need to like to know how these things work. But it's something that you can do without like knowing so much of programming, but like vibe programming will enable even more people to create their own games because they don't know how to program a single line.
What are the principles of game design that you want students to know before they step into that arena of creating games?
When it comes to principles of game design, I would say that level design is awesome to make, but is one of the most difficult things that you're going to do as a game designer. So learn that properly before stepping in. And also like animation. Be very patient with animators because animating for video games specifically is just on my book is much more difficult than coding. Like, because coding, you have like that very like specific mentality of like being very linear on your thoughts that you need to have. Like animation, because it's much more like artistic than just the line thing. It just goes everywhere. So like be patient with with the artist. So yeah. And also localizers, everybody. Like localizers are doing a huge job in trying to translate to from A to B. Be very so be careful and like give them like as much material as you can because they need that context. They're not going to like publish your your game with that information. They know better. So give them the context so they will have like a better version of that game for you rather than like just hiding things up from them.
As partners, invite them in the process as
Exactly.
partners.
Yeah. At the end of the day, like be a good person and be partner of like everybody, like help them.
What does good level design look like? Because that was the first thing that you mentioned. Level design. What are the things that we need to know when we're designing levels in a game?
Because level design needs to be logic and they need to be logic for somebody that is not creating the game. So you need to be aware of like who your audience is and what your audience basically thinking in a way that they will be able to solve either the puzzle or that combat. So like you need to be very aware of like who your player is and how that player is thinking even before like starting creating what your game, before starting creating the game itself. And that's one of the hardest things that like a game designer will do.
What is a key idea you want people to remember from our conversation today?
Video games are amazing and they're complex. So don't be afraid of exploring them. And there are several ways to look at video games and explore. So don't be afraid.
What are some sources of inspiration or resources that you recommend for people who want to learn more?
So there is a book called Understanding Video Games, which is basically like a good breakdown of like the different parts of video games and how they work. That is always a good start. And also the book Historiographies of Game Studies that I actually have here. I don't know if you can see here. This is a awesome book also. In case you want to know more about video game studies, how it came to be, and what are the future that holds for this area of study. So yeah, these are my two recommendations for today.
Excellent. Do you have the authors on those by chance?
This one, the Historiographies of Game Studies was edited by Alicia Carabinus, Carly A. Kirkrek, Cody Mujur, and Emma Volson.
Dr. Maria Fontolan, where can people find you online if they want to connect?
So I have Blue Sky, so it's at Marina Fontolan. I also have LinkedIn, just tag Marina Fontolan. I'm probably the first one showing up. And I also have a website, marinafontolan.com. Okay,
Excellent.
which has links to everything.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today about video games, about localization, about the intercultural forces in video games, and even about how people can get into the industry of video game design. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much for inviting me.